Mr. Prime Minister, thank you for talking to us. You know, 2020 has started for you as political leader of this country in a way that no one could possibly have predicted or anticipated. A plane full of innocent people blown out of the sky. Who do you blame?
I think when we see rising tensions and conflict and military actions anywhere in the world, it is always innocents who get sideswiped by conflict, and that's why in my conversations with other world leaders, in the work that we're doing together, we're trying to de-escalate the tensions in the region.
You have seen so much grief from the families. You've met many of them personally. Their promising lives cut short. So many families across this country bereft now. Is there any way that you can console them?
I think the grief they're going through is not to be consoled right now. They want answers. They express anger and outrage, but also just immeasurable pain. And what we can do and what we have to do is be there for them and answer the questions they have that we have answers for, give them the support either here at home or in Iran, make sure that we're moving forward as an international community and answering these questions. Obviously there's families across the country who are asking these questions, but there are families in other countries, in Sweden, in Afghanistan, in Ukraine, and in the UK who are suffering as well, and that's why we're coming together as an international community to demand answers and to move forward on the next steps.
What questions are the families asking? What do they want?
It's a range of things. Obviously, in my conversations last week, it was, did Iran do this, and are they going to take responsibility? And I think some of the moves that were made by the international community, including Canada, at sharing the evidence that we had, even at a preliminary stage, encouraged Iran to come forward and take responsibility, which was a good thing. But the families also have very tangible questions, like when can we bring our loved ones home to Canada, their remains? How am I going to pay my mortgage? How am I going to get the supports I have, because I can't go back to work because I just lost my wife and child and am completely lost, but I still have to pay the bills. Who's going to be held accountable for this? What are the next steps? How are you going to support us? Like a range of questions that are varied, but all questions that we need to answer.
On the question of justice and accountability, that is what you have promised, but you are working with Iran when it comes to that. What does justice look like to you?
I think the first step is having this admission of responsibility by Iran, which was a very big first step, but there are lots of more questions that need to be answered, and that's why it's not just about us working with Iran, it's about the international community coming together. All the countries who lost citizens on that flight will be meeting on Thursday in London at Canada House. We're hosting those next steps as we look to demanding justice. I think full admission, acknowledgement of responsibility, and some form of compensation is going to have to come.
This regime in Iran is not one that has a history of being accountable or transparent and open. So can Canadians trust it, do you think, to deliver those results?
I don't think there's a lot of trust, but I think the first indication that they were willing to accept responsibility and not try and cover it up, well, completely anyway, it shows there is a willingness to move forward and take responsibility, but that is exactly the question I asked directly to President Rouhani, asking him to ensure that there was justice for the victims.
You have spoken to President Rouhani once, I gather.
Yes.
What was that conversation like?
It was a conversation which I was very firm about needing answers for Canadians, about the terrible loss suffered by Canadians of Iranian origin, but also the entire Canadian fabric, that we've lost university professors, that we've lost family members, we lost promising young people, and the community and the country is gutted.
Did he make a pledge to you about justice and accountability?
The first pledges were around cooperation on the investigation and full support to enable consular access by Canadians. And I can confirm that all the visas that we requested to get Canadians on the ground, investigators and folks for consular support, have been emitted by Iran. So there are positive steps, but there are lots more to come, and we're going to make sure that they keep happening.
I guess one of the questions is access to the crash scene, or the debris from the crash, right? Which has to be very closely analyzed.
Yes, that will be a part of the investigation. Canadian investigators will be there as part of the investigative team assembled by the international community. But the other piece will, of course, be Canadian expertise in helping identify the remains and bringing home the loved ones.
You know, you've probably heard, I'm sure, about the CEO of Maple Leaf Foods, who has put out a statement on Twitter, Michael McCain, who says he is mourning and he is livid, and that his anger, he says, time isn't making him less angry. And he's very clear on who he blames. He lost a colleague, and that colleague had a colleague lost his wife and his young child, 11-year-old child. Michael McCain blames, this is what he said in his tweet, U.S. government leaders unconstrained by checks and balances, and he says a narcissist in Washington tears world accomplishments apart and destabilizes the region. Is he wrong?
I've heard many Canadians express a range of conclusions, of emotions, outrage, grief, loss. University of Alberta professors were expressing to me their anger and bewilderment about who's going to carry on the research work, the leadership that they had in the community. There are so many more people than just the Iranian community or the immediate families of people lost on this flight who are asking some very, very big questions and trying to figure out their answers. And it doesn't surprise me to see a range of conclusions and messages coming from all Canadians of different types.
Do you think that the people who died on that plane are collateral damage in the tensions between Iran and the U.S.?
I think if there were no tensions, if there was no escalation recently in the region, those Canadians would be right now home with their families. This is something that happens when you have conflict and war. Innocents bear the brunt of it, and it is a reminder why all of us need to work so hard on de-escalation, on moving forward to reduce tensions and find a pathway that doesn't involve further conflict and killing.
The tensions between the U.S. and Iran certainly make the whole world less secure, make the whole world uneasy. Is there anyone who can mediate between the U.S. and Iran?
I think the international community is being very, very clear both on needing to have a non-nuclear Iran moving forward with the JCPOA, while at the same time managing the tensions in the region that are brought about by U.S. actions as well. There is a complex web of shared responsibility throughout the region right now for conflicts that we need to be focused on. What are we doing to help out the Canadian forces there as part of the coalition in Iraq fighting against Daesh is a piece of bringing peace and stability to that region, stabilizing the country of Iraq, which has regional consequences as well. We need to make sure we are doing everything we can to avoid further inflammation of tensions.
Have you spoken to President Trump, or will you speak to him about the need to de-escalate tensions?
I have spoken to him, and I have talked about the need to de-escalate tensions. I've talked about the tremendous grief and loss that Canadians are feeling and the need for clear answers on how this happened and how we're going to make sure it never happens again.
Did the U.S. warn Canada that it was going to target and kill General Soleimani and potentially put Canadian troops in danger through that?
No, we didn't get a heads up.
Does that annoy you? Is that the wrong thing to do?
The U.S. makes its determinations. We attempt to work as an international community on big issues, but sometimes countries take actions without informing their allies.
Would you have preferred to have a warning?
Obviously.
Yeah. What is the message now to Iran's leadership?
The message to Iran's leadership is that we are watching very carefully the next steps for the families. Our focus right now and the way we are engaging with Iran, a country with which we haven't had diplomatic relations in many, many years, is entirely focused on this element. How are we ensuring that families who have suffered such terrible losses are getting the answers, are getting the support, are getting the justice that they need? And that is the message we have for Iran, and collaboration on the investigation, collaboration on consular support, working with them to support these families at this time of grief is what we are looking for from Iran right now, along with general de-escalation of tensions, which seems to be happening at least right now.
Do you know when families might get some word on repatriation of the bodies, which will be so crucial to?
That is one of the big questions that the families have asked me. For many of them, it is a religious priority to try and bury their loved ones as quickly as possible. Unfortunately, in situations like this, we're talking about weeks, perhaps even months. But consular officials are aware of this, and we're all working as quickly as we possibly can to bring these people home.
And you're hoping that Canada will be able to, Canadian officials will be able to play a role in that?
Canadian officials will be playing a role in that. There's already been an outreach for Canadian DNA expertise and other things, and we will absolutely help in any way we can.
Right. What has this, as I started this interview, I said 2020 started in a way that none of us could have predicted or anticipated, a terrible start to this year, so much loss across this country. What is it doing to you as a leader? Is it, as time passes, from the moment we learned of this plane being shot down, are you at a stage of grief or anger or both, or where does it leave you?
I am hurt like all Canadians. I am angry like all Canadians. But unlike many people, I actually have a job to do that is going to be able to help these families directly. Getting answers for them is my entire focus right now. Supporting them through this grief, rebuilding strength within the community so they can continue to contribute tremendously to this country is what I'm focused on, and that is what we all need to think about. These our fellow Canadians need help, need support, and we can all look at ways where each of us can help them as best we can. And I think that's one of the pathways through grief for all of us, is to try and look for ways to help each other.
And is the second part of this de-escalating in that region of the world, making it a safer place?
Oh, absolutely. The conversations I've had with the Iranian-Canadian community about how they return back and forth, have family members back home, making sure that there is a better sense of peace, of safety, of opportunity, of lack of conflict in the region is something that is very, very tangible for that community, but is of interest to everyone.
And you've probably seen what's happening on the ground in Iran. There have been huge protests, a lot of anger on the streets, people shouting things like "death to the liars" and "we want justice." What do you make of what's happening there, and do you think it could be a turning point in Iran?
We lost 57 Canadians, but Iran lost 80, more than 80 citizens as well. There are a lot of families bereft in Iran as well who are also asking for answers, just like the Canadian families are. There is anger, there is frustration, there is a demand for justice, and that is entirely to be expected, and it should be heeded very carefully by the Iranian government.
Mr. Prime Minister, I know the business of government has to carry on as you're dealing with all of this, so I wanted to ask you a couple of other questions related, first, particularly to British Columbia, the Coastal GasLink natural gas pipeline, which hereditary chiefs are blocking. They say they want to meet to have government-to-government talks. Are you open to that idea? I
have had excellent conversations with Premier Horgan, including this morning, about that, about other things. It is well being taken care of by the provincial government, but obviously we all have a role to play in the path forward on reconciliation, and we will continue to engage with the Indigenous communities right across this country on issues that matter to them, including with the Wet'suwet'en.
So government-to-government talks between your government and the hereditary chiefs is a possibility?
I think right now it is a provincial government engagement with them that is happening as it is appropriate. It's a provincial project and provincial processes, but of course the federal government will continue to engage.
On the topic of reconciliation, I know it's a difficult one, but is there an easy way to determine who has authority, the hereditary chiefs or the elected band councils?
I think that's a reflection that is part of reconciliation that has to be led by Indigenous peoples themselves. When you have an elected band council that has signed agreements with various entities, corporations and governments, that has a certain weight to it, but there needs to be a reflection on who speaks entirely or who speaks in part for different parts of the community, and that's part of the process that we are working out together as must be, but with them leading on this.
But right now it seems intractable. It seems like there isn't a solution on the horizon.
Well, I think that the British Columbia government seems to be engaging with everyone in a way that seems to be moving forward, but there's a lot more work to do.
Let me ask you about the Teck Frontier oil sands mine in Alberta. This is a project that, if it gets approval, would be the largest oil sands mine in Alberta, about 85,000 barrels a day of oil by 2026. Alberta's Premier has asked you to expedite the approvals process. Where does that stand?
We created an approvals process that is much more rigorous, that involves Indigenous consultations, that involves looking at the full range of environmental science and making sure we're getting things right. We've also moved forward on ensuring a price on pollution. We've ensured that there is a cap, an absolute cap on oil sands emissions. We are going through that process right now, and that process will result in a decision, but I'm not going to prejudge what that decision might be.
And a timeline for that is not clear?
Not entirely clear, but they're working on it within the respective timelines.
Sometime this year?
Yes, that's expected.
Okay. Let me move on to Meghan and Harry, the Duke and Duchess of Sussex, also making headlines today. The Queen confirms that they will spend part of their time, at least in this transition period, in Canada. Has the Canadian government been involved in negotiating that and helping make that happen?
We haven't up until this point, not in any real way, but there will be many discussions to come on how that works that will go about between officials at different levels.
So because they are royals, your government would play some role, right, in them coming, if they come here?
Indeed.
Yeah.
But there's still a lot of decisions to be taken by the royal family, by the Sussexes themselves, as to what level of engagement they choose to have. And these are things that we are obviously supportive of their reflections, but have responsibilities in that as well.
Are we going to pay the security costs for them if they come here?
That is part of the reflection that needs to be had, and there are discussions going on.
So we're not sure yet about where all that will land?
We're not entirely sure what the final decisions will be, where the dispositions are, and those are decisions for them. I think most Canadians are very supportive of having royals be here, but how that looks and what kind of costs is involved, there's still lots of discussions to have.
Yeah, the New York Times said, I think, that we're giddy with excitement to have the Duke and Duchess here.
Yeah, they also called us a frigid wasteland, so I think
they did.
Vancouver today notwithstanding, I think one has to take everything written about royals in the newspapers with a very large pinch of salt.
But you would welcome them in Canada should they choose to come here?
I think there is a general feeling of appreciation for the Sussexes.
All right, Mr. Prime Minister, thank you so much.
Thank you, Dawna.
Thanks.